Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar and meeting sponsored by the CTS Transportation Safety and Mobility Research Council. My name is Tony Fisher. I'm a transportation planner at the Met Council, and I serve in the role of chair of the Safety and Mobility Research Council. A little background about the councils. The CTS councils provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. The councils bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. Sam will share a link to more information about the councils. Today's webinar features presentations on impact of speed limit changes on urban streets. I'll share more about the presentations and presenters in a moment, but first I'd like to turn it over to our Council Vice Chair, Joe Gustafson, who is co-facilitating this webinar. Joe, if you could introduce yourself and cover some of the logistics for the webinar.
Yep, thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, I guess now. For those that don't know me, my name is Joe Gustafson, and as Tony mentioned, I'm this year's Vice Chair for this CTS Council, alongside my day job as traffic engineer for Washington County. For today's event, we are looking forward to audience participation and questions. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature or type the word share in the chat if you have a question or comment. That way we can unmute you to share verbally. Or if you prefer, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type your question or comment for the speakers. There will be audience Q&A following the presentations. As far as professional credits, this event meets the continuing education requirements for 1.5 professional development hours credits and 1.5 American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP, certification maintenance credits. If you need a PDH form, please send a chat message to all panelists with your name and email. We will email you the form following today's events. CTS will be holding one other transportation research webinar this spring that you may be interested in. On Wednesday, May 8th at noon is a webinar on autonomous technology in transportation maintenance operations. Information on how to register will be available on the CTS website. All of these events are free and anyone is welcome. And finally, if there are any students joining us today, could you please send a chat with your name? We do like to track the number of students who are engaging in our events. Thank you very much, and I will turn it back to you, Tony.
Thank you, Joe. I'd also like to share that Gina Boss, Sam Honduville, and James DeSoda from CTS really do a lot to plan these events and are also on today's webinar supporting us. So in 2019, new Minnesota legislation began allowing cities to set lower speed limits on local streets without special approval. In February 2021, University of Minnesota researchers surveyed 33 cities within the Twin Cities metro area to determine whether they were planning speed limit changes. They identified the city of St. Louis Park, which was planning a citywide speed limit reduction to 20 miles an hour with select roads at limits of 25 to 35 miles an hour. And the city did agree to participate in a before and after study evaluating driver speeds. In this webinar, University of Minnesota researcher Gary Davis will discuss this study and its findings. Jack Sullivan from the city of St. Louis Park will outline the city's approach to speed limit changes, offer perspectives on the study's findings, and discuss a 2-year review of the changes that is currently underway. I'm pleased to welcome today's speakers, Professor Gary Davis from the University of Minnesota's Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering, Jack Sullivan, Engineering Project Manager from the City of St. Louis Park, and Deborah Heiser, the Engineering Director from the City of St. Louis Park, is with us to help answer any questions. Gary?
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. All right. So you see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay. All right. So as was mentioned, in 2019, the Minnesota legislature loosened up the rules about setting speed limits, okay, and allowed cities to set speed limits on roads over which they had jurisdiction. which was a major change, okay, from the statutory limit, which had currently been 30 miles an hour with an option of setting 25-mile-an-hour limits in certain special cases here. And so in 2019, the Local Road Research Board put out their research needs statement number 580. I'm quoting from that. What it stated was that further studies should be completed to examine the relationship between changing the posted speed limit sign and the change in vehicle speeds when there is no change in the roadway environment. And so we wrote up a proposal responding to that, okay, pointing out that here was the possibility of doing a natural experiment where we could take a look at what the speed behavior was on the roads before a change in the speed limit. All right, and then do a similar measurement afterwards and then do a comparison. So we got the go-ahead to go ahead and do the study. So to get started, in February 2020, we sent out a survey to our 34, if I remember right, city engineers, okay, in the Twin Cities metro area. One of the conditions that we kind of placed on the study was we didn't want to have to drive halfway across the state, okay, in order to collect our data. Okay, we wanted to keep it fairly close. 8 cities responded. Two, City of St. Louis Park and the City of Edina indicated that they were thinking about taking advantage of the new rules here. And one of them, City of St. Louis Park, indicated that they were in the process of kind of the beginning stages of the process of actually implementing this. And they agreed to work with us, okay, on our before-after study. I'll also point out that both Minneapolis and St. Paul, both cities also took advantage of the change in the legislation to allow them to change speed limits, but they were so fast off the mark, all right, that we simply, there was not a window in which we could get in and collect before data, all right, before they implemented their changes here. So St. Louis Park provided us with their documents, okay, that they had prepared to kind of get started with this. And then in January 2021, we did a follow-up, okay, to see what was transpiring here. And City of Edina indicated that they were still interested, but at that point anyway, they weren't able to let us know that they had a definite plan, all right, to implement this. Whereas St. Louis Park provided us with their draft plan and let us know that tentatively they were hoping to implement the change late in the summer of 2021. So on my screen here, I've got 2 figures, okay, taken out of St. Louis Park's draft plan. The left-hand figure shows speed limits on the streets in the city as they existed, okay, before the change in the speed limits. And then on the right-hand side is the proposed changes here. And so what you can see on the left-hand side is most of the streets, okay, had the statutory 30-mile-an-hour limit. There were a few, these guys here, these little blue streets, okay, where the 25-mile-an-hour limit had been okayed. And then a couple roads here like Cedar Lake Road, okay, with limits above 30 miles an hour, in particular Cedar Lake Road at a 35-mile-an-hour limit. All right, so afterwards, what you can kind of see was what was intended was that most roads would go down to a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. There were a few, okay, that were going to be left at the 30-mile-an-hour limit. A few others that were going to, instead of a 20, they were going to get a 25-mile-an-hour limit. And so based on this proposed change, what we started working on was our data collection plan. And so looking at the proposed changes, okay, one of the things we wanted to try to identify, all right, were roads that were going to get a speed limit change, and then roughly comparable roads where the speed limit was going to be left alone. And so we were able to identify Cedar Lake Road, a collector that runs east-west through the city of St. Louis Park that was slated to have a reduction from 35 to 30 miles an hour. And then Minnetonka Boulevard, which is a county road, okay, about a half a mile south of Cedar Lake Road, all right, where the speed limit would stay at 35 miles an hour. And then we identified, for instance, Texas Avenue and Louisiana Avenue as a pair, one of which was going to have the speed limit reduced to 25. The other was going to have the speed limit left at 30. Morningside Road, okay, kind of crossed the border from St. Louis Park into Edina. And at least at the time we were putting the plan together, this would be a nice comparison between a stretch that was going to get a reduction and a stretch that was not. And then Lake Street, which crossed the boundary between St. Louis Park and Hopkins, okay, had something similar. And then we identified, in addition, one pair of roads where both of which were going to get the 20-mile-an-hour limit, one of which currently had a 30-mile-an-hour limit, and then one which had a 25-mile-an-hour limit, and then 16 additional locations, okay, scattered throughout the city. That gave us 28 sites, and then we looked at the speeds separately in the two directions on the roads. These are all two-lane roads. All right, giving us 56, I guess you might call before-after comparisons, all right, that we could make. Okay, so data collection, the before data collected in June through August of 2021. All right, we used road tube counters, okay, to collect the data. We started out with only 2 counters, and we were collecting data for 1 day at some of our sites. Okay, about partway through, we obtained some additional counters and then started leaving them out for 2 days. All right, data collection was almost always on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I think once we might have collected a second day's data on a Friday. Okay, we left out weekends. And our after data collection then, okay, we tried to do is try to get out at the locations that we collected data in 2021. All right, at roughly the same time of year, same days, okay, in 2022, after the city of St. Louis Park had implemented their citywide changes, which occurred in November, December 2021. 4 sites we kind of lost the data from. One of them, the road tubes came loose. Okay, one of them, Minnetonka West, was having some trouble with sewer problems on the days we were going out to collect data. And then on Morningside Road, it turned out that the city of Edina also implemented a speed limit change. So we kind of lost our treatment comparison option, okay, for that one. Okay, so figure here just kind of shows roughly in the northern part of the city, okay, the different locations that we collected data. Some to notice here, here's Cedar Lake Road, and then down here's Minnetonka Boulevard. So here's a treatment comparison pair. Here's a treatment comparison pair. Here's Louisiana Avenue. Here's Texas Avenue. So here's a treatment comparison pair. Kind of looking at roads that we collected data in the southern part of the city, okay, kind of scattered around through here. But let me kind of jump forward and start getting to our results. All right, so in this figure here, okay, what I'm showing is in the top graph, all right, each data collection location. So we got a location, and then at each location, we got the 2 directions there. So for each of these separate speed samples, we've plotted the average for the day that we collected, and then an approximate 90% confidence interval around that. So the top graph was the before data. And so we've also plotted the speed limits, okay, at these locations. And so kind of what we can see is over here on the local streets where we collected data, the tendency was in the before period for the average speeds to be a bit below, okay, the current speed limit. Over here on the collectors, I guess what we can see is, well, some of them had average speeds below the limit, some had average speeds above the limit, and but just kind of generally, at least on the collectors, the speed limits were kind of roughly tracking, all right, the average speed behavior. Whereas on the local streets, okay, generally, okay, the average speeds tended to be below the limit. The graph down here below, all right, shows the average speeds in the after period, and then also the speed limits, all right, in the after period. And so what we can kind of see here is, well, when we drop the speed limit down to 20 miles an hour, all right, the average speed in general, okay, on the local streets tended to be up above, okay, that 20-mile-an-hour limit. Our one little non-changed road here, Lake Street and Hopkins, okay, we can see the average speeds are still a bit below the limit here, whereas the two road, the Lake Street and St. Louis Park, where we dropped the limit, okay, now the limit's quite a bit below, okay, the averages here. Looking over here at our collectors, again, I guess what you can kind of see is that the average speeds aren't a lot different, okay, in the after period compared to the before period, meaning that in general, on most of these roads now, the average speed tended to be up above, okay, the reduced speed limits here. Okay, we also summarized the 85th percentile speeds on the roads, and then again calculated approximate 90% confidence bands for those. What we can see is on the local streets, before the speed limit change, 85th percentile speeds, some were above the limit, more were kind of down below the limit. On the collector streets, the 85th percentile speeds tended to be above the speed limit, okay, on almost all the roads. After the speed limit change, I guess what we can see is that as with the average speeds, there was not a lot of change in the 85th percentile speeds on either the locals or the collectors. When we dropped the speed limit, what that essentially meant was that in this after period, the 85th percentile speeds tended to be above, okay, the new posted speed limits here. Okay, and so we also, okay, on the recommendation of the project's technical advisory panel, calculated what's called the 10-mile-an-hour pace, okay, at all our locations. That's the 10-mile-an-hour range that contains the highest fraction of the individual sample speeds in it. And so I guess what we can kind of see is that in the before period, 10-mile-an-hour pace on our local streets, okay, seemed to indicate that speeds were tending to be below the posted limits. On the collectors, okay, the speeds tended to be above the speed limit, but not radically so. And then after the speed limits are dropped, again, what we're kind of seeing is that our 10-mile-an-hour pace is generally, okay, up above the current posted speed limits. Okay, so we also took a look at changes in the mean speeds at our locations here. So essentially kind of what's here is the black band, okay, is the zero change. Okay, that means that on that location, there was no change in the average speed. at this, say this location here, what we've got is the average speed after the speed limit change was about a mile an hour above what it was before, and ranging between roughly 1.5 miles an hour and half a mile an hour, okay, in that range there. And so I guess what we can see, all right, is on our local streets, okay, some of the average speed changes were in the positive direction, which means that on average speeds were faster in the after period compared to the before. On more, the average speed tended to be below, okay, or negative, okay, meaning that the average speeds decreased in the after period. Although generally the changes in the average speed were smaller, okay, than the 10 mile an hour, 5 mile an hour drops in the actual speed limits here. Looking over here at the collectors, our average speeds are, again, tending to be negative, okay, meaning that the average speeds showed some tendency to decrease after the in the after period compared to the before. A few, okay, showed an increase, and some of them showed fairly marked differences, okay, before versus after here. So kind of the general trend, okay, just kind of looking at the graph here, is a trend towards a decrease in the average speeds in the after period compared to the before. Although again, the changes in the range of 1 to 2 and possibly 3 miles an hour are noticeably less, okay, than the actual changes in the speed limit, okay, that was implemented here. Okay, speed variance. Okay, what we wanted to look at was there any change in the variability, okay, in the speeds before versus after? The measure we chose to use is the ratio between the variance in the speeds before versus over the speeds after. So a value of 1.0, okay, would tell us that the speed variances were the same in the before and after period. A value above 1.0 would tell us that the speeds were more variable in the after period compared to before, and a value less than 1.0 means that speeds were less variable after compared to before. And so what we can kind of see here is on our local streets, well, some roads were more variable after, a few were maybe less variable after. Looking at our collectors, I think it's maybe a slight tendency, okay, for variability to go up, okay, in the after period compared to the before, but being offset to some extent, okay, by some roads where the variability seemed to be less, okay, in the after period. Okay, so kind of just summarizing, okay, what we saw in these graphs. Looking at, for instance, local streets where the speed limit was 30 miles an hour before and 20 miles an hour after. All right, we had 14 instances, okay, where that was the case. And the average change in the change in the averages, okay, for that bunch was a negative 0.81 miles an hour, which means that on average, speeds were a little bit lower in the after period compared to before. The average variance ratio 1.3, which means that kind of on average, speeds were a little bit more variable, all right, in the after period. All right, we had two instances where we went from 25 to 20. The average speed went up a bit. Okay, the variance also went up a bit. Our one pair of directions, okay, where we stayed at 30, also a small change, okay, decrease in the average and a small increase in the variance here. Looking at our collectors, where we went from a 30 to a 20 mile an hour change, speeds on average down a little bit, about 1.5 miles an hour. 30 to 25, speeds on average a little bit down, by 1.5 miles an hour. 35 to 30, down a little bit, 30 to 30, down a little bit. All right, and 35 to 35, okay, down, okay, just a little bit here. And in all cases, the variability either stayed the same or increased a bit. So what do we draw from this? The mean free flow speeds in the summer of 2022, after the city of St. Louis Park implemented their citywide change, on average were slightly lower, around 1 to 2 miles an hour, compared to the summer of 2021. The speed variances in the summer of 2022, on average, were slightly higher than they were in the summer of 2021. And in the report, okay, we advance an argument that if one of the effects, okay, of the speed limit change is to kind of divide the drivers, okay, on a road into one subset that's continuing with business as usual, and another subset that's at least making a limited effort, okay, to comply to the new limits, then what you would expect to see is a small decrease, okay, in average speeds and a increase, okay, in the speed variability here. And that seems to be, that's at least, that our actual findings are kind of consistent with that expectation here. And the other thing to point is when, looking at all the sites, there's substantial variability. Okay, we've got locations where speeds went up on average. We got locations where speeds went down at average. We got locations that became more variable. We got locations that became less variable here. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, okay, out there, okay, on the roads in St. Louis Park. And so what can we say? Observed reductions in mean speeds were less, okay, than the reductions in the speed limits, which is not surprising, okay, because other similar research in other cities tended to find the same thing. If you lower the speed limits, but you don't have either some changes in the physical nature of the road to kind of enforce the limit, or changes in enforcement to try to enforce the limit, okay, generally you don't see a big change, okay, in mean speeds after you do a reduction here. And so something I just want to point out is kind of thinking in terms of the time frames that are operating here. By a historical accident, okay, the city of St. Louis Park also happens to be the place where I live, okay, or have lived for the past 30 plus years. All right, so these roads where the speed limits changed are roads that I've been driving for a long time. And so what I can say did not happen, okay, is after the speed limits were changed, there was a switch that went off in my mind, and all of a sudden I was following these speed limits here. My habit was to just continue driving the roads the way I've been driving them for the past 30 years. And then to start to realize that if I want to change this habit, I have to deliberately choose to do that and make a point of trying to follow the limits rather than try to do business as usual. I suspect others might find themselves in that same boat, okay? And so one of the things that would need to happen if you wanted to see, okay, a marked change in average speeds is a substantial fraction of the drivers on those roads, okay, deliberately trying to change their speed behavior habits, okay, in compliance. That may or may not be successful, okay, with some of the folks that have been doing this for a long time. And it could very well be that if we want to see a substantial change, all right, in the speeds, we might be having to talk about a change in generations, okay, where these older folks that have been driving the roads with the old limits for 30 years get aged off the road here, okay, and replaced by a new generation that kind of grew up, all right, with these speed limits as kind of their environment they drive in. And then something also to point out is that, well, we do have vehicle automation supposedly on the way here. If one actually has an automated vehicle that can detect a speed limit and the vehicle itself chooses a speed, okay, then we might start seeing a lot more compliance, okay, with these new limits here. And so our recommendation, okay, at the end of our report, all right, is we ought to think about tracking these changes over the longer run, okay, to see to what extent maybe habit change and changing in what drivers are used to, okay, starts moving the speed population, okay, in the direction, okay, of the new speed limits here. So let me wrap it up. First of all, put out some thanks to Christopher Shong and Josh Clavens. Those are the students that helped, okay, with the data collection in 2021, 2022. If you want to know more, our report on this has been published by MnDOT. It's report 2023-22, and you can find it on the Center for Transportation Studies website without too much trouble. And at that point, I'll wrap it up. Not sure whether we're going to save the questions and comments to the end of both presentations or whatever, but at this point, I've got no more to say.
Thank you, Professor Davis. I do see a couple questions that popped into the chat that are specific to your presentation, so I'll read a couple of those.
Okay.
You noted that you use road tubes. Did you have to weed out turning vehicles, such as vehicles turning into a driveway, or small axles, such as a bicycle, or assuming something other than a car and a truck?
Yes, definitely. Our kind of rule, all right, we have, so first of all, we were using time mark road tube counters, okay, and so they do have a proprietary algorithm that tries to sort out, okay, the vehicle type, okay, based on the tube pattern. All right, so anything that was like a semi truck, we tried to throw that out. Anything that was like a bicycle, we tried to throw that out. We had a rule that there had to be at least a 4-second headway between vehicles for us to include it, okay, so that we were hopefully getting free flow chosen speeds rather than congestion-based speeds and things like that. All right, so some effort to screen it was there. I don't think we had a way of identifying turning vehicles from the tube behavior. All right, so if a vehicle was like turning into a driveway as it was going over our tubes, it might have slipped in there.
All right, thank you. I think that answered a couple of the questions. The other question, I'll group a couple of questions together here. As far as the type of roads, did the data collection include any residential streets, or was it strictly focused on these collector corridors that you had identified? And then also, are all these roadways single lane, or were any of them multi-lane that allowed passing?
Okay, so these were all 2-lane roads, okay, 1 lane in each direction. The majority of the sites were on residential streets. The collectors were, well, even the collectors had houses along them here. Okay, I'm trying to think. Not much in the way of like industrial sites, okay, turned up here. Almost all these were residential streets, whether they were local streets or collectors here.
All right, that's what I have for questions on this one in the interest of time. So I'll turn it over to, I think Tony has to introduce our next presenter here.
Stop the
Nope,
share here.
I guess I can do that. Looks like Jack is up next.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe. For those of you, I'm Jack Sullivan with the City of St. Louis Park Engineering Department. Hopefully my screen's coming up well for everyone to see. And also I have with me Deb Heisert, the Engineering Director here at the City of St. Louis Park. The two of us have been on a 4-year journey related to speed limits in our community and the changes to those. Professor Davis did a great job of really diving into some more analytical approaches. I'll do a little bit of that with my presentation, but I'm also going to take a step back and talk a little more about how we set our speed limits within the city, what we promise to do to our community, and for our council, during this change, and what we've kind of seen since then, and maybe some next steps. So that's kind of how I'm going to break out my presentation. So Professor Davis's information will be kind of embedded, and we did a parallel study ourselves, kind of in my presentation as well. So as we all know, the state statute changed in 2019. Our community, our council, saw neighboring communities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, starting to implement reduction in speed limits, and they asked us to kind of take a little bit of an approach, a study, an analysis to see if it was appropriate for our community, and if so, how. So we'll talk about that, and then just to state that the idea or the concept of reducing speed limits for eliminating fatalities or serious injuries, kind of the mobilization or mobilizing, prioritizing walking and biking first and transit, then motor vehicle use, was very much in our strategic priorities, very much in our comprehensive plan, very much just made a lot of sense for our community as a whole, contributing to equitable outcomes for all users, kind of just giving off this presence, elevating the idea that safety is really important in our community, the ability to get around in multiple ways. And one of the ways to do that is by addressing the speeds, or at least making that a contributing factor. So that was really the goals that was set out early on. When I say early on, we kind of started looking at this back in 2020. And what that looked like for our community is we needed to figure out kind of what folks were driving. What was the current speeds on the roads? We know what they were posted. You saw the graphic a few minutes ago from Professor Davis that they were posted for 30. They were state statute for 30, the vast majority of them. But what were folks really driving on them? And how are we going to get that data? So we have the luxury of having a lot of historic counts, over 800 counts throughout the community that were done either through speed board collection, tube counts for traffic studies, our state aid counts that we do on a four-year cycle. We had a lot of locations, like I said, 800 or so different points, and most of those points had different timelines on them, right? So that every 4 years, or back to the 50s, not quite 50s, but back to the 70s in some cases. So just a lot of information. What we're able to do with a lot of that information is to start to kind of put it into categories or buckets. And we really realized very quickly that a lot of these speeds that were being traveled were kind of falling into the 20, 25, and 30 category. I think that was really important. And that was the first kind of approach of talking this through, analyzing this information, bringing it forward to our council and study sessions, and really talking about what that looks like. I think it's important to note here too that a lot of our data collection and our analysis was done based on average speeds, as we were kind of considering what to set our speed limits to. A lot of talk about 85th percentile historically in the transportation world, but we really decided that the average speeds are a more representative approach to determining how we would move forward. So like I mentioned, we started this in 2020 with community engagement, council engagement, and we quickly started doing that data collection that I just kind of shared with you, speeds, volumes, and some crash analysis. Eventually, we wrapped up in 2021 with the community process, with our council acknowledging and that moving forward with a reduction in our speed limits across, I'll say, almost every single street in town that we own, locally owned. I think it's a good distinction here that Professor Davis had some analysis on some county roads, Minnetonka Boulevard, Excelsior Boulevard, some streets that were just outside of St. Louis Park as well, but that we were obviously going to implement local roads only, those owned and operated by the city of St. Louis Park. We had budgeted early on roughly $200,000 to do the full change out. We came in under that, but between engineering analysis and contractors switching out signs and installing new gateway signs, it all adds up. So we did spend a lot of money on changing out speed limit signs across the community in the process. So we actually implemented our speed limit reduction in late 2021. Actually, we finished up just after Thanksgiving, so it was late November, just before the ground froze. It was kind of good timing, a little later than we had anticipated. As Professor Davis mentioned, we were hoping to do it a kind of late summer, but the reality is we really got going just before the year end with a full implementation. And that was really just changing out the signage, and then also kind of kicking off an education component of that. During this process with our council, we committed that we would come back to them with some analysis. What's going to happen? We would come back about 2 years later and really talk through what we saw. Did it have the intended changes to our community behavior, driver behaviors we were hoping for? And if there was kind of any recommendations or thoughts moving forward now that we've had a couple years under our belts. So there was really 4 things that we shared and committed to our council that we would do. We would compare some vehicle speeds before and during this trial period. And I say trial period, I think now it's fully implemented and we're moving forward and we're not looking back. But at the time, there was always that inkling of, well, is this the right thing? Are there unintended consequences? Were there other things that we weren't aware of that by checking back in 2 years later, we'd be able to better understand? We were going to take a look at crashes. And as I mentioned early on, vehicle, bike, and peds, we place a high priority on the pedestrian bicycle network in our community and really felt that we needed to look at all of those incidences that were occurring. We also wanted to and shared that we would be kind of monitoring our police and engineering feedback that we receive. Are there things that are going on that we needed to be aware of that were happening in the community that our police department was seeing or experiencing, or our engineering department was experiencing? We're usually the first call when there's a request for a stop sign because folks are speeding, when there's something else going on that really is related to a driver behavior or driver speed issue. And then we also shared with our council that we would be coming back with a recommendation of what we would be doing in the future moving forward. So beyond that 2-year window. So to ground everyone again, we took 20 and 21 to do the actual analysis, and we let all the system operate in 22 and 23. And so this is kind of where Professor Davis's data collection occurred. This is where our data collection not necessarily proactively occurred, but just occurred in the sense that we were out collecting tube counts on our annual basis. We were doing a lot of those 4 steps that we just talked about. This map is identical to the one, or very similar to the one you saw in the previous slides. However, what we did, because we didn't want to duplicate Professor Davis's work, so we focused on our local roads, the ones that went from 30 down to 20. And we had 16 sites in town that we figured and analyzed and realized we could effectively do pre and post speed limit adjustments, data collection on. They try to represent a cross section of the community as a typical road. You can see geographically, they're kind of all over the map, a little less in the northwest corner. We, like Professor Davis, had some challenges with tubes or construction or other things that just made the data collection less than desirable, or just we were concerned about the results. So here again, what we did is really wanted to supplement and do our kind of own independent review of some of these speeds. And what you'll see here is in this little box in the lower right is very, very similar results, a reduction in our average speeds of about 1 mile per hour before the speed limit changes were enacted to after they were enacted. So this was on the 16 sites. We had a pre-reduction mile per hour of 22.1 and a post-reduction average around 21 mile per hour. So just a slight reduction, but however, there was a reduction. We also promised that we would take a look at crash data. And this graphic here really represents crash data for a 6-year period. We broke it out into 2-year, 3-year buckets, or 2-year buckets, excuse me. The kind of 2018, 2019, the 2020 and 21 during the pandemic, and then the post-pandemic 22 and 23 time periods. This graphic does not represent all the crashes we had in the community, just represents the more serious vehicle crashes, and then all the ped and bike crashes. What we found with that data, and I think that this graphic here on the left is probably the most telling, in the sense that we saw our crashes on city-owned streets. Here again, we took out all the county roads, we took out all the MnDOT roadways, just said on our local street network. Crashes were fairly high, and I'll say increasing pre-pandemic, like all the metro and like all the state, I'm sure. We had a rather large reduction during the pandemic time period, and then this rebound that has occurred since then in 22 and 23. I will say that our rebound is still 20 to 25% lower than what was seen pre-pandemic. One of the things that's not shared on this slide is we compared this to Hennepin County-wide local streets, so Golden Valley, Eden Prairie, Edina, Minneapolis, as well as metro-wide. And the charts look very similar, just on a different scale, obviously on the magnitude of the number of crashes, but everyone saw this roughly 20 to 25% reduction in 22 versus kind of the pre-pandemic time periods. One of the other things that we wanted to really look at and better understand is how did our severity of crashes change pre-pandemic, pandemic, and then post-pandemic. And I'm kind of, I guess maybe I'm using the word pandemic or these kind of 2-year buckets here a little differently than the changes to the speed limit, because it felt like it was really hard to use that data during that, the 20 to 21 time period here. It just felt like it was so much lower. And we keep showing that in all these graphics. It's so much lower that it really felt like it was hard to justify. So we really went back and utilized this 18 and 19 data versus 22 and 23 data, and see that our severity and number of crashes reduced. And then the bottom chart here just shows a little bit of kind of what the FHWA utilizes or uses as cost analysis for each crash analysis. So here again, trending in this less number of crashes and less severe crashes across our community. We also took a look at the pedestrian bicycle crashes, and this was a little harder as we start to get less and less numbers of crashes. It's a little harder, and there's some variability in those numbers as you get this. I would say our total crashes has stayed relatively consistent at 24 to 25 for the last 6 years. However, what we have seen is our fatal or more serious injury crashes being reduced, kind of starting off at 24 and kind of working our way down to 20. This is just the data that we're seeing from our community. And this took data up through the very last day of 2023. Some of this number crunching was done in early this spring when the data was available through MnDOT and other sources. So what we found, which is very similar to what Professor Davis had uncovered in his findings, and it was great that they were consistent, and it was really helpful in sharing to our community that it was 2 different groups, 2 different entities were able to come up with very similar results on a large number of streets in town. We had 16 streets that we analyzed for speeds, and then of course all the crashes. Professor Davis had 28 locations in town. So we were approaching 50 spots in town that we were able to kind of collectively analyze. And we found that there is a small reduction, that 1.1 mile per hour reduction in average speeds. We also found that by changing the speed limit or adjusting it lower, we were able to be more aligned with how drivers were actually driving those streets. They were a little closer to the posted speed limit. And the other finding that we shared with our council is that we really did not believe that there was any need make any significant or any changes at all, quite honestly, within the system, that the speed limits that we've set are really inappropriate for the community. I think as we go through any of these processes, its messaging is really important. For our council, the message that we shared with them was this 1 mile an hour reduction is exactly what we had anticipated, is what previous studies had seen across the country. But that, I guess we weren't surprised to see it here as well. And we were pleasantly surprised that it was in the right direction. That we didn't recommend any changes to the speed limit. That really, the changes that we implemented after our analysis in 20 and 21 had met and it really achieved the goals that we were looking for during that time period. From our standpoint in the engineering department, what did we see, or what kind of our messaging? We're trending in the right direction. Yes, it's small number of mile per hour reduction. Our crashes that have gone down probably can't be attributed to the speed limit changes, but everything is still trending in the direction we want to go, towards 0 death. All of these things are going the right way. Our police department, their messaging is they're going to continue to enforce. Their enforcement, though, is not any greater or any less than it was before we adjusted these speed limits. And that is important, I think, to state, because there was some concern that there could be some unintended consequences of changing speed limits and how police enforcement occurred with those different speed limits. And from the community's perspective, our message is we need to continue to educate. We need to continue to education. And what I'll talk about that in the next slide here a little bit, because there is a lot of lessons learned from our community as the kind of what we would maybe do better or differently, or what we need to continue to do, and what we found to be very effective through this process. The first one is speed limits. Changing the speed limit in our community had a small but very positive impact on driver speeds. Yes, it's 1 mile an hour, but it's trending in the right direction like we just talked about. We also need to continue to find ways to educate, get the word out, whether that's social media, whether that's our quarterly publications that we do, whether it's TikTok videos, whatever that needs to be, we need to continue to educate. We continue to hear from our community that education is needed. Couple ways that we have done education, and I think that really has been really well received, is the 20 is plenty signs. To date, we've handed out over 600 of those in the last 2 years. And I see them pop up all over town. I see them kind of wear out and new ones pop up in their place as they kind of get beat up by the snow plows or the summer sun. And the other one is speedboard trailers. These are the ones that you can tow around. Our police department actually is in charge of those, but we work collectively with Public Works and Engineering. Those move around town on a weekly basis through the warmer months, so basically May through October. We found that those have been a great approach for really being responsive to folks. They stay out on a site about a week and then move on to the next location. It's a great way to educate drivers of that road, a reminder. It also collects speed and volume data, which we continue to build out our GIS database and just continue to get that information that we can utilize for what the next time we hear from residents about driver speeds on that section of roadway. We need to continue to work on enforcement. And I just say that work on it, we just need to continue to do it. It's a part of it. My standpoint, I'm in engineering. I collaborate with all the other departments to the best of our ability. We understand there's challenges with each department, whether it's Public Works, Engineering, Police, whoever that might be. And we just need to do what we can in engineering, and we need to make sure that our other departments are able to do with what they're able to do as well, and supplement where we can with that. And the biggest thing, I think a kind of a comment came up in the chat a few minutes ago, lowering the speed limit to 20 or 25 or whatever that might be for your roadway is not the end-all solution. That's been well documented. No surprise to any of us in this realm, this community. It is not the single answer. It is a suite of answers. We still have to implement geometric changes to roadways when reconstruction occurs. We need to consider roundabouts. We need to consider roadway narrowing, lane narrowing. We need to consider all those other things to help with driver behavior and driver speed. That just changing it to 20 isn't going to be the solution. I will say, though, the flip side is by posting 20 miles an hour, our community and those people that visit our community know what's important and help to understand that driver behavior, a balanced network that serves all users, bikes, peds, transit, and the single occupancy vehicle are all important. And this is just another way of getting that word out that this is a strategic priority for our community. It's in our comprehensive plan, and having a livable, walkable, bikeable community is important and will continue to be. And this is one of the approaches that we're utilizing to get there. I went through that kind of process pretty quickly. I'll just kind of spend 30 seconds here and kind of recap exactly what we kind of found, which is, we had to take 2 years to work through, should we change our speed limit? And I want to make sure everybody's aware too that, our city council didn't change the speed limit. They passed and changed our ordinance that allows our speed limits to be adjusted appropriately, right? It gives us some flexibility in that. That was also done obviously at the state level, but we also had to change our ordinance and how our speed limits were set. And we wanted to make sure that we got it right the first time. And so we did a lot of analysis, a lot of engagement to make sure that really occurred. I will say then, we said that and recognize that there would be some apprehension in this. And we recognize that a 2 or 3 year time period here to allow this to settle out into a normal state was going to be very important, and that we would come back with kind of these findings at the end of the day. It was very fortunate that Professor Davis and his team was able to kind of supplement or do some of his analysis at the same time, and that the results came out very consistent. And I mean, that was one of my biggest worries kind of going into it a little bit was, boy, I hope we're not polar opposites here, right? And if so, why? And getting at that. And then I think kind of the last part of this is, now that they've implemented for 2 years, now that we're going to continue to recommend and continue to keep these at this location, or these speed categories, these groupings of 20, 25, and 30 throughout our community, what do we need to continue to do as a community to make sure that we're giving everyone the best chance of kind of adhering to this? That would be the last piece of that. And I think Professor Davis hit on the head. Some of this will be generational. Some of this will be kind of learned behavior over time. And all we can do in engineering, or the best things that we can do in engineering, is continue to educate and continue to design and build roadways that reinforce that different driver behavior. And the other aspects of it will come along, right? The enforcement will come along. Those other aspects of it will continue to be there to supplement and enhance the collective groupings that we're doing with this initiative. So that's really what I had in mind. I'm sure there's probably a few questions that kind of popped up. I'd be happy to answer those along the way as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thanks, Professor Davis. Great presentations. We do have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to ask Joe to help with that. But maybe before we jump into that, Deb, did anything come to mind that you wanted to share watching those presentations, or should we jump straight into Q&A?
I would just like to mention what Jack had mentioned, is that as the city engineer, the evaluation, and I really enjoyed the partnership with Professor Davis. Obviously you can see he had all the graphs and a lot of data, and his was very scientific. Ours was, maybe not as in depth, but really appreciate the U and appreciate LRB for that help, and just here for questions.
Thanks, Deb. Take it away, Joe.
All right, this is my chance to remind all of our viewers to use the raise hand feature to ask your questions verbally, or type your questions and comments using the Q&A feature, and I will try to read off as many of those as I can as time allows, and then the speakers can respond. So I will lead off with mostly an engineering question that builds off of one of the questions we received here. There are a couple references made to choosing a design speed. And so design speed has always been a choice, but I'd like to ask from the city's perspective, to what degree were posted limits influencing your choice of design speed, both in the before and after condition for your city road projects?
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. I think I'll start with that one. I'll allow others to jump in here if they have anything to add. From our standpoint, we are, so maybe when we have the opportunity to reconstruct a road and look forward to what that road should be, we're looking at, I think design speed is certainly in the back of our minds, but I think it's more contextually that we see a lot of it to do with what are the other features that want to be and share in that right away? Bikes, ped infrastructure, canopy trees, all that other stuff that goes into it. And then at the end, a design speed, I will say, kind of falls out from that. I think more often than not, and recognizing that we're not going to have big swings here. We're not going to have to go from what was a 25 or a 30 and go to a 45, or we're not going to go from a 45 to a 20, right? In most cases, these are these 5 and 10 mile per hour changes. But contextually, I think we're looking at design speed almost as not the last thing, but it certainly precipitates out from the bigger discussion about what we want this road to be as a character. So maybe that's from if and when we have the opportunity to reconstruct a street. I think from kind of what do we have out there in the system and how did we go from 30 to 20 and kind of that design idea. And I think at least in St. Louis Park, we have a lot of straight roads. We're kind of a grid system. A lot of things are pretty flat. It's really easy to go fast. Relatively speaking, right? It's easy, right? But we all design things so that you can see everything and when you do that, you create a road that you can also go fast on. So it goes back to that other topic a minute ago of what are the geometric things that we can do, and what are the other cues that we can give the drivers to help maybe change that design speed to thinking to more of a driver speed. So I don't know if others have anything to add to that, but those are kind of my thoughts on how we've approached design speed criteria on street projects.
And Jack, I would just add that keep in mind, we are a mature suburb. We ain't building new roads. What we got out there is what we got. We reconstructed Gary's Road in 19. Pretty much what you see is what you get. And so it's different when you've got an urbanized space, an urbanized area.
Let me just butt in here. That question kind of came up in my highway design class this spring about this difference between design speed and speed limit. And what I tried to get across to the class was, well, the design speed is something we engineer so that your basic average driver can drive comfortably at that speed. And a speed limit is a social policy. And those are just two different things. Sometimes they're in accord, okay, sometimes they're different.
So perhaps just as a quick follow-up to that one, so did the change in legislation change how the city is approaching design speed?
I would say the answer is no. We've always looked at it as a context-sensitive solutions for our reconstruction projects. What are we trying to put through? What are we trying to do with that? All
right. We have a couple questions about enforcement. So I'll rattle off a couple of those and kind of let you answer them as a whole. One is, did the city get buy-in right away from the police department regarding enforcement? What can you say about changes in enforcement? And then there was one that was specific to citations. Did speeding tickets increase after the speed limit changes, and how did the community feel about the enforcement of lower speeds?
I'll start with this. Oh,
Okay.
go ahead.
Can I just start with the buy-in, and Jack, you take care of the rest of it. I actually, when I first started, so we've had some staffing changes. So when we first started, I was a lot more involved with traffic. And we have a traffic committee, and this was 10 years ago. I had police officers telling me we needed to reduce our speed limits. So the short answer on that is absolutely yes. They really felt that 30 was too fast at our local areas. They were kind of baffled, just like, what do you mean we can't set our own speed limits? And tried to explain, some of them were saying, well, Wisconsin's 25, why is ours 30? So, again, so I think the reason we did this is because of the legislative change, and our council directed us to look for ways to do this. We did it with an ordinance change, and then we did it with with a study, but police were very much partners throughout. So I'll turn it back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, and to kind of build on Deb's point, we do meet, on a regular basis with police. We have a traffic committee where we talk a lot about a lot of different traffic issues around the community, but every month speed becomes one of those. Related to, did our enforcement or did our patrol change? And the answer to that is there was a distinct and defined acknowledgement of not changing the level of enforcement. We didn't want to see this we didn't want this to be seen. No one wanted this to be seen as anything that could have unintended consequences, whether it's from a race equity perspective, kind of coming off of some of the pandemic timeframes, and just with some of the staffing challenges with the police department. The idea of trying to raise or lower enforcement didn't make sense. Status quo, for multiple reasons, made the most sense. I will say that we actually have seen a little bit of an uptick in the number of citations written. And I will say, I think that is now because there is a larger discrepancy when that vehicle is traveling, say, 35 miles an hour on that 20-mile-an-hour posted residential street or whatever. That discrepancy is bigger, and it allows them the ability then to be more to address that in a more appropriate way. So more to come on that. When I say that, it's because we're just now a quarter of the way through the year. I'm kind of looking at some graphics that the police department had sent over. And yes, we are seeing an increase in citations, but it's because, like I said, we saw an increase in 23, and we're seeing an increase in 24 as we're kind of coming back up to kind of normalized levels.
All right, I'll move on to the next questions here. So from a community feedback perspective, now that the public has seen that the change was about 1 mile per hour, do the members of the community still largely support the reductions? Have you received any feedback since the research study was released? And do you still get pressure for additional downward changes? People saying that the reductions weren't enough.
We always hear downward, more changes, right? And I think I truly believe that to be kind of an educational component. What I mean by that is before we had the changes to the speed limit, we had the same request: put up more speed signs, put up more children at play signs, put up more stop signs, more things to control and manage driver behavior on my road, right? On the street that I live on or the street that I work on. And I think this is just an extension of that, quite frankly. And I think the educational component of what they're really asking for is, I want other drivers to be aware of what the speed limits are. And we can do that by these changeable message signs that get put out there with the speed radar trailers. We can do that by proactively giving them some of these 20/20 signs and give them those opportunities to kind of work in their neighborhood and educate themselves. We work through our neighborhood associations. Typically, we have a really strong neighborhood association, multiple of them. We have, a number of neighborhood associations. So working through those groups to get the word out, it becomes more of an educational thing, I think, than it is a put up more signs or put up different signs, quite frankly.
All right. Had a question about other driver behaviors that might be related to speed. So it was specifically a question citing some research about driver willingness to yield as it relates to the speed that they're already driving. So you saw an approximately 1 mile per hour difference, depending on the context and the location and corridor. Have you seen or have you heard reported anecdotally any change in other driver behaviors, whether it's yielding to pedestrians or other things that drivers do?
Well, I see Deb smirking over there. We did not look at that, and I have, to be quite frank, have not really heard a lot about that. If anything, I've heard just the opposite, right? Where drivers yielding pedestrians is still woefully inadequate, and drivers completely stopping at stop signs is woefully inadequate. And we've done a few similar kind of studies, analysis, to kind of take a look at those stop sign compliances there's, as Professor Davis stated, there's maybe some generational things there that need to kind of work through the system, but there's also this just expectation that well, both of those are poor compliance, yielding and stopping for sure. I don't know if others want to add anything in, but it's not something we have heard correlated or connected to this reduction in speed.
All right, thank you for that. I did get a message from some of our hosts here that we have 2 individuals with their hands raised, but I actually don't see that on my screen here. I can only see the presenters. So I'm hoping that Samantha or James, you can maybe help me navigate that part. But while you're sorting that out, I'll throw in one other question that we had here in the chat, which was, let me find it here. VMT, have you seen any change in VMT or bicycle trips during the same study period?
Well, that's not something we directly looked at per se with the numbers related to this. I will say I had one of those graphics there with the number of accidents or the number of vehicles, and you could see this huge reduction during the pandemic period. It was no surprise to anyone. We are doing more analysis and data collection on our bike and ped infrastructure throughout the community. That's a real challenging one, though, as everyone's kind of realized, how do you get really good data? You get really high numbers on a good sunny day, and you get really low numbers on a cold wintry day. So there was no correlation, at least in this study that we did. Anecdotally, though, we are building a lot of infrastructure around the ped and bike and transit system, and we just will continue to see increases in those user or trips related to those mobility means.
Joe, I can help you with that hand raise. It looks like it's Ken Hansen. If we can unmute Ken. Ken, are you able to share?
Oh,
okay.
Ken didn't mean to have his hand raised.
Joe, I think we have a few more minutes, but I've got a question if you don't mind me jumping in.
Go for it.
So I think this is a pretty big change, kind of a really new look at how to approach something, given, there are a lot of safety needs we want to address. And I think St. Louis Park is also leading in a lot of ways in addressing climate change. And we face the challenge of really making meaningful impacts on equity. And I just wonder if, Deb, if you have thoughts on, how an agency goes about really addressing some of these, not just doing our day-to-day work, but really like reimagining how we're doing things. And yeah.
Certainly, Tony. We have a community that has five strategic priorities. And everything that we do, we try to tie back to those and how we'll further what's important to the city of St. Louis Park, our community as well as our council. We have a climate action plan with a carbon neutrality by 2040. That is, I think, probably one of the most aggressive climate action plans in the state. That's all tied in with the vehicle miles traveled, the bike ped infrastructure. We're building out. In 10 years ago, Jack and I were given a map with 30 miles of bikeway that we were said, go make this happen. We've been adding sidewalks. We've put in almost 25 miles of sidewalk in the last 10 years just to fill in gaps. Promoting transit in our comprehensive plan, we have prioritization, which is to flip the pyramid, which is pedestrians first, bicycles, transit, and then vehicles. So every project that we have, we are given that as a priority. Whether it's we're going to be reconstructing Cedar Lake Road, we're going to be reconstructing Louisiana. How do we create space for bikes and peds? How do we create space in a city that was built, for cars, and trying to retrofit that? Roundabouts, climate action plan, reducing the greenhouse gas. We've been having conversations with the council about stop signs and greenhouse gas, having people to have to stop. Well, they're not. First and foremost, I think if you've ever seen a study that's been completed for urban stop signs that are unwarranted, 80% of the people don't come to a stop. So having that conversation with the council and using that and saying, hey, if we're really about this, let's, talk about safety expectations, all of those things, climate action planning. On the other side is that, street trees are very important. Again, carbon sequestration for bicycle, taking a car off the road versus a tree, but the trees are also traffic calming. So how do you do all these things and navigate it and educate and talk through it? It's all important, and it's challenging. And so your question, Tony, is how is the city doing this? We have a council and a community that believes in all of it and working through it. So yes, it's only 1 mile an hour, but it's trending in the right direction. I agree with Gary. It's about culture change. I actually had a resident call once saying we had put the speed board out, and this was before we changed speed limits, and the 30 was on the speed board. The resident called and said, what did you do? Change the speed limit. It's supposed to be 25. He grew up in Wisconsin. He had no idea the statutory in Minnesota was 30. So that is what Gary's talking about, is it's going to take generations. It's going to take those conversations. But we've been seeing an increase in biking and peds in our city. We've been getting streetlight data. We've been talking about ped counting programs. There's a lot of energy. And I think it is all of our policies, all of our strategic priorities, race equity, is based on visioning, hearing from the community, from the ground up. So does that help, Tony? It's really the ground up.
Yeah. I'm hearing, strategic priorities, I think, is helpful. A lot of times we're pulled in a lot of different directions, but then, having that community support helps. Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, whenever we have a council report or study session report, those 5 strategic priorities are right on the front page, right? And it's a checkbox kind of thing. And so it's not only frontal for, staff as we're doing it every day, but it's frontal then as a reminder to the council that these are, this is how it ties back in. And to Deb's point, it creates this network, this web that furthers that goal. And I think so often I think that's been really successful too, is having that as one of the first things after what's the topic, it's the kind of what's the strategic priority here, has been helpful in just pushing those forward.
Well, I really appreciate St. Louis Park showing up today. Appreciate the work they're doing. Appreciate Professor Gary Davis sharing his work today. Joe, unless there's one last burning question, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Okay. So as part of these meetings, we do also like to have a little bit broader conversation. So we have a chance for a round robin, and we just have a few questions to kind of spark that conversation. Let's see if I can put them in the chat here. Ooh. Yeah, what current transportation safety and mobility issues are you and your organization facing? Do you have any organizational, informational, or event updates to share? And what ideas do you have for potential future council meeting topics or speakers? We have these events about twice a year, so we're always looking for ideas on interesting presentations.
Well, let me butt in real briefly and say the project we're currently working on has to do with effective vehicle automation on safety. And it's still kind of in the preliminary stages, but that's definitely a topic everybody's talking about. And hopefully sometime in the near future, we'll be able to have some results, okay, on what we're doing here for MnDOT.
And I'm assuming you're looking at kind of a transition phase, as there's kind of a mixed traffic of automated and human drivers.
Essentially, that's it. Yeah. Okay. The two things we're trying to estimate is the relative crash risk for automation versus non-automation, and then also the current market share, okay, for automation. And we can pull that off, okay, then we'll be able to put together a little spreadsheet so that you can make a prediction. If you're predicting your ADT is going to be X and your market share for AVs is going to be Y, all right, it'll give you a prediction what you think the crash rate will be, okay, in that scenario.
Is there any news or evidence that automated vehicles are really happening? I mean, it seems like it's been 5 years away for a long time.
Well, partially automated stuff is out there. Okay, like emergency braking and forward collision warning and stuff like that. And there are some interesting results that seem to indicate that when that is out there, it does have a crash reduction effect.
Tony, I'll just add that when I was at ITS America in Phoenix a week and a half ago, I rode the Waymo self-driving vehicle. You hail it just like an Uber or a Lyft, and I rode it like 5 times while I was there for the conference, and it was really interesting. And I think that we always talk about that it's important for people to experience it, and in order to kind of better understand what the technology can do. So I think that, so I don't know, maybe everybody should go to Phoenix and give it a try. Or what else? See, I think they're also in LA and San Francisco and Austin.
We saw them in San Fran. They're very interesting, but they weren't in operation when we were in San
Mm.
Francisco. They're pretty cool.
Yeah.
And we've had a couple demonstrations here in Minnesota, Rochester, and I think up north, universities,
Yep.
probably for those.
Yeah, Go Marty is, I mean, but those all had onboard operators or safety operators, safety drivers, and you don't have that when you're in Phoenix. It's just like taking a driverless cab or a driverless Uber or Lyft. So
And I think it's fair to say we don't have to wait for the safety benefits, but once we do have that widespread, fully automated automation across society, it's really going to impact our lives and our roads and the way we travel.
mhm.
Perhaps a question on that to Professor Davis in the early stages of the study you're working on, and also to those of you that have ridden in one of these self-driving vehicles. Tying back to today's topic, do you believe or are you seeing that these automated vehicles will strictly obey the posted speed limit? Or if they choose something else, will they base that on their responsibility to society at large, including pedestrians that might possibly be in the way? Or is the responsibility to the customer and the owner in terms of selecting the speed that has the least differential from other traffic?
Oh, well, the short answer is some of the, well, I got a 2024. Okay. It lets me know what the speed limit is, but it does not insist that I follow it here. That seems to be the state of the art, okay, out there on the roads right now. I think automated vehicles following strictly posted speed limits, that's another social policy. we'll have to decide, you know, at a legislative level, that's what we want. If we, I'm sure it can be done, okay, right now, if we decided we wanted it. All right. The question is, do we want that? And there doesn't seem to be a consensus on that issue.
Joe, I can give you an example when I was riding, actually. So a pedestrian was trying to cross in the middle of the block, and he was in kind of a marked area that was, you know, for not for turning or whatever. And the vehicle stopped, and the pedestrian's like motioning, like, go. And I'm kind of sitting there, I'm like, we're not going to move. You better go. And so I don't know if he realized that there was no driver, but he kind of looked again, and then he walked, you know, he finished walking across the street, and then my vehicle, you know, proceeded on. So I mean, that was really interesting to me. I was like, oh geez, what's gonna happen here? And, you know, similarly, a vehicle kind of, you know, pulled out in front, you know, did a turn right in front of the vehicle. It wasn't overly aggressive, but, you know, it was cutting a little close, and the vehicle handles those kinds of things just fine. So it's interesting.
And Gary, the bottom line, that I love the way you put this as a policy question. And, you know, I went to the Lifesavers Conference last year, the pleasure. And so a lot of stuff structured around the Towards Zero Death, towards the Federal Highway Administration Safe Systems approach. And a lot of the sessions that I went to there were about vehicles and this idea of policy, because the Safe Systems approach is about safe vehicles, you know, and there are companies out there that put on their company cars, you can't speed. And that's the company's policy. We've got safe speeds, which is what this webinar was about, you know, setting up those speeds based on the vulnerability of humans. Safe road users, and what that means is creating space that that they can cross. Post-crash care, emergency response, and safe roads, how we design the road. So that's the triangle. And so the safe systems approach is something that we've been talking about internally. We're going to be doing our safe streets and roads for all comprehensive safety action plan, kicking that off pretty quick here. But that policy part is just this big monster. And how do you know, and somebody told me once is that when you change the speed limit, you've taken away someone's time. And that to them is valuable and not irreplaceable, is what somebody said to me. And so it's, you know, it's how people perceive it.
So that sounds like a few votes for automated vehicles for a future topic. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our participants for all the great questions. Thank you to our guest presenters. Thank you to CTS staff. Everyone have a good day.